Hello everyone, this is Tyler here. It is middle of January, beautiful day here, and I'm going to discuss some things that are psychologically, I think, very toxic for a guy, and ways that you can improve these problems. Now, we're really going to focus on is media and how media is essentially used it's a sort of combat in your head, in your mind. It's like psychological warfare that the people in power, the elites, use to control people. This is really what it comes down to. It's about control. Now, I'm not going to dial in as much over that area of control. I'm going to focus here more on exactly where it's coming from and how to avoid it and just other things to be aware of. Okay, so we all know here that mainstream media is more accessible than ever before in history. And also there's more alternative media that's also extremely accessible now that we've never experienced in history. And it's via newspapers, computer, television, cell phones. And there's basically thousands of websites, news websites, and forums, and all kinds of places to get information. Having information is very good, it's entertaining, it's interesting, but at some point it can be very oversaturating, especially for younger people nowadays, because it's also very hard to dissect what's good information and what isn't, and how much is too much, and how to properly discern information into your life when it's useful and when it's not. And many people obviously have had a lot of issues now. I think many of the incel crises that have happened, these very massive problems, like Elliot Rogers, one of many incel guys that have committed these acts of rage. And I think one of the culprits was media. Media, like I said, it's used for control purposes. It's used as a sort of warfare, and I think it's actually used often, especially nowadays, to combat people against other people, masses against the other masses. Us against them is often what's told to you. And I won't list any people here, but even within this particular area of the internet. We see this within Manosphere, PUA, MGTOW. There's guys out there that will even say it's us against them. And like I said, I'm not going to cite people who say this. I think everyone knows of at least a few guys out there that like to use this expression. Irrespective, though, what we can see, though, is that it's using distracting people from the real issues in it, like sports or other kinds of situations where you're against an opponent. It's a distraction, and it's to pin people against each other, but it's not really the real culprit. The culprit should be people going up against the real people in power, the people in charge. And I think even what just happened a couple weeks ago in DC at Congress, this was a fine example where guys realized, wait a minute, we aren't here to fight common people. We have to actually go to the heart of the beast. Yes, did they actually face-to-face get in contact with the people in power? No, but they were certainly much closer than almost any other case in history. This was an historic moment, and trust me, countries saw this, and the level of respect for the U.S. plummeted quite a bit for many countries after that moment. And not because of what those guys did. Those guys did something that was very brave, very courageous. Many of them are going to be facing kangaroo courts in the coming months, and they did something that was very brave to go up against the system, and they displayed to the world what the U.S. is really about and what it's became. And that was very important. And also the fact that rather than them going up against common people, they went up against the real beast of the system, the real people in power, the elites. That the oligarchs, the plutocrats, whatever you want to call them, they went up against those guys. And at the very least, they made a demonstration. And yes, much of the world saw it. And I think it was very touching for people worldwide. I can say that from here in Estonia. I'm almost 5,000 miles, 4,000 miles from DC. And yes, it was very monumental moment, honestly, what they did. But this, like I said, what was awesome in this case is the fact that instead of it being more of like, it was us against them, but it was them as in the real people in power, the people in charge, the plutocrats, the people that run the government, not against other common people, common folk, like we saw with Antifa and BLM and all these other movements where it's not really against the real perpetrators, the people that are actually stealing their freedoms, that are causing problems in their life. And this is really key to remember here. Media, of course, is used as a way to cause, it's like a psychological warfare. And it can be very destructive. I believe many of the incel attacks, one of the major culprits of it was because of media. These guys were exposed to certain kinds of media, or they weren't, and it probably played into their minds. Because also, I think people at a younger age, it can be more impactful than as someone gets older, maybe less and less impactful. So media, you have to really understand and discern what's good and what isn't. It's not just in the form though of news and magazines, it's also in television, it's in movies, it's in shows. And this is also very impactful. There's so many political messages now in television and movies. I was just watching a movie on Netflix. I have a 1-month free subscription on Netflix. When Netflix has their monthly free offers, I take it because I will not pay for a Netflix subscription. I think half of their shows, the Netflix branded ones, not the non-Netflix, are hugely saturated with political messages, and I get tired of it. Honestly, I get super tired. And I also believe that a lot of the shows have kind of a more negative and pessimistic undertone, and I myself prefer something that's more positive. Only in exception cases do I like shows or films that have kind of a negative undertone to them. I was watching this Netflix movie. It was from 2015, and there were so many political messages in this film of under 2 hours. And I couldn't believe it. This wasn't even Netflix branded. And I could see all the political messages sprinkled into the show. And this is how they push propaganda. This is how the mainstream wants to drive political narratives, is through films and shows. And you have to understand that. So also be aware that know when you have to avoid certain shows or movies, or just simply not watch them at all, or watch very little. And that's one of the things I do, for example, nowadays, is I will only watch like maybe within the first 10 minutes. If I get like bad vibes within the first 10 minutes, even if it's a pretty good movie, I just stop it. I won't watch any further. Often also, I think it can really screw up your psyche during the rest of the day, especially if you watch them earlier in the day or at night when you go to bed. You can get terrible nightmares and maybe wake up feeling really poor the next morning after watching one of these types of shows or movies. And you got to always be aware of that. And like I said, it's propaganda. It's the same thing. In this show, the movie, it's the same driving point that it makes common people, it pins common people against other common people. It's not the actual legit culprit in these situations. They're not displaying who actually is to blame for what the system is. And this is just how it is. So now, yeah, there's certainly some good films and shows, whether it's on TV or Netflix, but as I get older, I actually find this to be less and less the case. And also the political messages are more and more driven in these shows and movies. At some point you have to think, is this really worth my time? Is it worth not just the time, but the emotional energy? If something makes you feel really terrible? Is it worth it? Maybe it isn't. And maybe just don't turn it on. I myself, I really appreciate foreign shows, foreign films. It's one of the areas I've really liked watching now the past like 5 years. And there's a really good website you'll have to check out. It's called onlinesovietmovies.com. There's a lot of great movies from Eastern Europe there. And I like the Russian and Ukrainian shows and films. There's really good shows out there. And it kind of gives me a break from some of the political narratives that I see being driven constantly in American shows and movies. Now, yes, do they drive political narratives in these shows and movies? Yes, they do. But often I don't feel they're as toxic. And I think, too, they're just more positive. The message is more positive. And after I watch them, just carry on with my life. It's not something that causes me to think as much and to just continue on doing what I'm doing, to focus on life. And that's why to remember that, like in shows, in television, in films, designed nowadays like Netflix to make you think, to trouble you, to make you to be really mad at other people around you, common people. You're in a state of paranoia. This is how these shows now are created, and that's especially bad for people who are schizophrenic, for guys who have other psychological problems. Constant exposure to these shows, it's like mental warfare, and it can be really bad. And that's why you have to know sometimes when to just cut yourself off and not to do it, not to consume this information. Because just like in music, in film and television, it's often doing the same thing that mainstream news does, and magazines, newspapers, online sites, that they're driving messages through film, through TV. Anyone who's worked in film knows that this is one of the most effective ways to drive a message is through this film and through very good cinema. You can create a message without actually having to state it, and you have visual reference here. And that's one of the reasons why Hollywood and the American film industry as a whole was so taken over by mainstream establishment, political establishments in the U.S. many decades ago. They understood this very well and could just basically constantly put it in films, just drive it and in shows non-stop on people, and people were easy to buy into this and just believe it, and not realizing that it's kind of like another political tool. It's used as a way to drive political themes or messages, and that's what it's became. So I spoke about the mental illness that's so common now for guys, and guys are not being diagnosed, or mainstream is totally not talking about it. They're not putting any focus on it, and it's horrible, obviously. But realize that also there's stimuli that can also trigger it and make it worse, especially for guys who already have problems, who have schizophrenia, paranoia, PTSD, all of these issues. It drives it and makes it worse. And so you have to know where to cut it and not to put those stimuli into your life, and when to avoid it. This is also too why the mainstream, why platforms and stuff, they deplatform people. They don't want their message getting out to the masses, because they understand perfectly well what I'm saying. It's not just what people can see or hear, it's what they can't see and hear, and that's why they don't want this alternative voice reaching the masses. At least now they don't. When it was very useful to grow audience and to grow engagement on platforms, yes. But then when they don't need them, they remove them often. And we saw this with Stefan Molyneux. Stefan Molyneux, regardless of what people think, he was very revolutionary. I mean, he had his own unique ideals on philosophy that he came up with, and he was, in my opinion, the biggest philosopher of the 21st century that was well known to the masses. And he reached a massive audience, and they obviously he presented in a very alternative perspective, and I think overall made people feel better about themselves and encourage people to live in the present day and to make the most of life. And very thoughtful and very engaging. But you would think, why would they remove a guy like this? So thoughtful, so engaging and positive for the most part, and actually helping encourage and try to make people's lives better, because that's how they are. It's a sick mentality, and like I said, it's a form of warfare. They don't like, if it's not being used to drive their message, they don't want it. And it's the same with newspapers and magazines. I've spoken about this before. It is fear-mongering at its best. It's fear-mongering. And this is something that some of my subscribers stateside, like in big cities, have mentioned to me before, that there's a lot of fear-mongering, especially with this whole epidemic this year or last year. They need to create constant paranoia situations, panic, and it distracts people. It distracts them from the real problems. The real problems coming from above, coming from the top, the elites and the plutocrats who actually run society, where the real problems are. They distract them, the masses. They drive the paranoia. And in these big cities, they obviously have made people mad at each other when they shouldn't be mad at each other, and they create conflicts and stuff. And you have to realize that, and don't let it distract you. I'm not sure how many of you guys follow the famous writers Walden or Thoreau. These are two very well-known philosophers. And I can't recall which one. I will include this in the channel, in the video below, but one of them basically stated that no news really matters unless it means that your life is in absolute danger, your life is on the line. That's the only news that's real important for people. The rest is to distract people in the present day, and it's not worth concern yourself much with. And I think this is really an important point he makes. He doesn't say exactly like this, but just realize that it's psychological warfare, like I said, and it's not really and a problem today is going to be replaced by a new problem tomorrow. And also realize that, yes, the common good isn't often at play in society, but maybe it's not. And also realize that these mainstream news outlets, media outlets, TV, film, music, television, they need to make money. They have to make profit. And if it's not interesting enough, if it's not moving enough, they're not going to make profit. They need to sell. They're selling a message and also a voice, which is being used as just one of many facets in the system. It's one pillar to control people, and obviously it's large private enterprises and companies that make most of the revenue from the mainstream outlets, and they have to sell. They need to make sales. And when you look at like the fact Washington Post is owned by Amazon owner Bezos, that's pretty telling of where the system is at nowadays. That's a private owner of a massive company that owns a supposedly private newspaper, and he obviously wants to get his voice across, whatever he thinks, whatever is needed to drive his agenda, his message. And at the end of the day, these guys, they don't care about you or I. All they care about is their bottom line. It's much more impactful to look at old literature, old works, Greek writers, Roman writers, very historical works, some of the famous Russian authors, much more prolific, the Bible, than these modern day works that have very little real substance, that are here today and gone tomorrow. And also it's being used as a weapon, as a source of paranoia on common people, rather than for common people to be concerned about the real issue. Why don't public libraries in America carry many of the famous historical Russian authors. You'll notice this. I noticed this when I lived in Chicago. At my former library, my public library, I could find mainstream news, mainstream magazines, and books. I couldn't find hardly any works from like Dostoevsky or Ivan Turgenev. Very famous and prolific authors. They may carry a couple of them, but they would be lacking like the very best works from Dostoevsky. And why? Because they don't want these guys of real substance in the library, in public libraries that we fund. They don't want this voice there that actually has real meaning to it and has a timeless aspect to it. Because it's not serving their agenda, it's not serving the mainstream agenda. And public libraries serve the interests of the federal government in whatever the narrative, the mainstream narrative is. The main key here is don't buy into the lies of corporate media. Don't let it disturb your lives. It's psychological warfare, whether it's Netflix, it's newspapers, magazines, whatever it may be. Understand that it can actually have the same psychological destructiveness as drugs and alcohol and other substances in people's life. It can be just as bad and worse. It's just it can be another stimuli, and focus on information of real meaning, especially if you have this, it really disturbs you in your day-to-day life. Don't let this fear and paranoia drive you, and just live your life. So give me your feedback below, and thank you.